You're now watching Around the Horne, the weekly internationalist news update with author and historian Gerald Horne.
Today is August 6th, 2025. Welcome everyone to the weekly series entitled Around the Horne, which is an internationalist news update with historian and Professor Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne's latest book, which was just released and is now in print and now available on the International Publisher's website, is entitled The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., from 1800 to 1865. Dr. Horne is also a permanent guest on the radio show, The Horne Report, which airs on Black Power 96 Radio on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and Dr. Horne also hosts a radio show entitled Freedom Now, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific, and replays of both shows can be found on the Activist News Network. Dr. Horne, thank you for coming back on the show, and welcome back to Around the Horne.
And thank you for inviting me. And before we go a step further, I should mention that today, August 6, 2025, marks the anniversary of a day that will forever live in infamy. I'm speaking of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, followed by the atomic bombing of Nagasaki in Japan, August 6th, then August 9th, 1945. These were crimes of magnitude that is difficult to wrap our heads around. Most significant episode of mass murder likely in the history of the world. I deal in part with the forces, the impulses that led to this crime in a couple of books I wrote some years ago, Facing the Rising Sun, which deals with African Americans in Japan, because of course Japan intervened, said Washington, in the internal affairs of the United States of America by seeking to establish on these shores an anti-Tokyo, an anti-Washington front, a pro-Tokyo front. In fact, as I point out, in November 1942 in East St. Louis, Illinois, right across the river from St. Louis, there were Black Americans in uniform who were engaged in military drills, and they were going to join a Japanese invasion of North America. Of course, they wound up being arrested, detained, and imprisoned. I should also mention that we need another analysis of the Pacific War in particular, the 1941 to 1945 war, which I attempt in the book on the screen, because in many ways, the Pacific War was like World War I. It was a struggle over colonies, whereas the war in Europe, 1939 to 1945, was a struggle between sovereign states, wherein Berlin was seeking to convert sovereign states like France, like the Netherlands, etc., into colonies. And I think that it helps to explain something that's often missed, but which I deal with in this book, Race War, which is that many of the anti-colonial leaders emerging after 1945, leading their countries to independence, particularly Sukarno of Indonesia, but also Mahathir of Malaysia. Of course, he's still alive at the age of 100, if not mistaken. Not to mention Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore. They were all pro-Tokyo to a greater or lesser degree. And in fact, Subhash Chandra Bose of India, who is regarded in New Delhi on a level akin to that of founding father Nehru, not to mention M.K. Gandhi, died fighting shoulder to shoulder with Japanese troops during World War II. So I'm not trying to overlook the magnitude of the crimes and the tortures perpetrated by the Imperial Japanese Army, not least in Korea and China. But at the same time, if we ignore this other history, I think we'll only have part of the story, and it'll hamper our attempt to understand what transpires after 1945, which is of moment in 2025.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, first want to ask you about the latest updates on U.S.'s trade war. First, it was reported Monday, August 4th, that the German Finance Minister Lars Klingbeil was in Washington to meet with U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent to discuss trade, global cooperation, and transatlantic ties. In the lead-up to the meeting with Bessent, Finance Minister Klingbeil told German media that, quote, weaknesses had been exposed during the wrangling over U.S. tariffs, and that as a result, he would be seeking various exemptions for German industry, and steel in particular. Also on Monday, August 4th, it was reported that South Africa is seeking new markets in Africa and Asia as it negotiates with the United States over looming 30% trade tariffs. South African government ministers expressed frustration with the U.S. over the tariffs, particularly as the 30% tariff against South Africa and comes as diplomatic relations between South Africa and the U.S. are in tatters over a range of domestic and international policies. In addition, yesterday, Tuesday, August 5th, President Trump said that he would, quote, very substantially increase the tariff charged on imports from India from the current rate of 25% over the next 24 hours, in view of New Delhi's continued purchases of Russian oil. President Trump also said that, quote, a zero tariff offer for imports of U.S. goods into India was not good enough, alleging that India was, quote, fueling the war in Ukraine. However, it was reported that despite Trump's threats to India, that Prime Minister Narendra Modi is sending his top aides to Russia. In fact, Prime Minister Modi is sending his National Security Advisor Ajit Doval and his External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar to Russia later this month as well. Lastly, Dr. Horne, The Lancet published a new report entitled Effects of International Sanctions on Age-Pacific Mortality, a cross-national panel data analysis. The report found that between 2010 and 2021, unilateral sanctions, imposed by the U.S. and its European allies, caused an estimated 564,258 deaths each year, more than 5 times the number of people killed annually in direct armed combat. Dr. Horne, how similar should U.S. tariffs and U.S. sanctions be considered? And considering the news we just highlighted, what is your accounting of President Trump's tariff war?
Well, as the saying goes, trade wars, and in this instance, tariff wars, are class wars. But they're also geopolitical wars. What I mean by that is something we've been stressing for the last few weeks, which is that with the pressure placed upon U.S. imperialism by China, particularly, and the BRICS in general, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and their allied partners, U.S. imperialism rather frantically is seeking to convert erstwhile allies like the Federal Republic of Germany, and particularly Canada, into neo-colonial appendages, while raising revenue for the U.S. Treasury, for the U.S. billionaire class more pointedly and more particularly, and that is going to take place at the expense of the U.S. working class, hence this idea that tariff wars and trade wars are class wars, because the U.S. working class and the U.S. middle class will have to bear the burden generally of paying for these tariffs that are placed upon imported VWs, for example, or imported Toyotas, for example. But as noted, it's also a geopolitical war. It's an attempt for Washington to scramble to try to remain in the status that it had grown comfortable with, that is to say, the post-1989 collapse of the Berlin Wall status of being the so-called sole remaining superpower. It's telling in this regard that South Africa, mentioned in the previous comment, is being tariffed at a higher rate than Zimbabwe, which is quite remarkable, given the fact that obviously Washington has animosity towards Zimbabwe, given that country being far down the road on land reform, and the discussion of land reform in Pretoria, South Africa, is what helped to trigger this animosity towards South Africa and these 30% or more tariff rates. India is also rather striking in this regard, because here it's difficult to comprehend what the overall strategy of the U.S. administration is, because we had thought that India was going to be enlisted in a key role in encircling China. Recall that relations between Beijing and New Delhi are not ideal. They fought a number of border wars, most directly in 1962, China has been supportive of India's major antagonists, speaking of Pakistan, including in the sharp clash between Islamabad and New Delhi just a few months ago. And yet, Mr. Trump in recent days has really been beating the drums against Prime Minister Modi and against India, because he says that India is buying oil from Russia, and he wants India to stop buying oil from Russia. India, of course, argues rather persuasively that its relationship with Moscow stretches back to Indian independence, August 15th, 1947. That relationship with Moscow has been quite helpful in India trying to countervail the pressure from Beijing. And in any case, India charges that this is hypocrisy, since the United States is engaged in trade with Russia at the level of billions, particularly on the pointed matter of uranium, and not to mention the collaboration on the International Space Station. And of course, the European Union does even more trade with Russia than the United States does. And so India feels that it's being picked on, and it has a persuasive case to make. Although I'm not so sure if Prime Minister Modi is sufficiently nimble to take advantage of this situation. I say this because just recently, India was engaged in military maneuvers with Philippines off the southern coast of China. This comes in the wake of Bongbong Marcos, the leader of the Philippines, paying a visit to the Oval Office just last week. I don't see that as coincidental. And not to mention the fact that many of Prime Minister Modi's supporters in the United States of America have really been clamoring in a vulgar manner against Z.K. Mamdani, the mayor-in-waiting in New York City, because Mr. Mamdani, who is of Muslim descent, although his mother is of Hindu ancestry, has really been denouncing the BJP, the party led by Prime Minister Modi, which has more than a scintilla of Islamophobia in its ranks. And as a result, in New York City, there is a campaign now led by BJP supporters to make sure that Mamdani goes down to defeat. And I'm not sure if the BJP supporters in New York City have thought this through in terms of how this will be enraging to many of us in the United States of America if their dream comes true, not to mention strengthening the right wing, which has India in the crosshairs as we speak. I should also mention, with regard to the question of sanctions, all of us, or at least many of us, recall the pulverizing sanctions leveled against Iraq during the Clinton administration some decades ago. And then Secretary of State, the late Madeleine Albright, conceded that it had led to heightened mortality in Iraq. And one could say the same thing with regard to ongoing sanctions against Iran, against Zimbabwe, against Cuba, against Venezuela. And I think that at the end of the day, what we're seeing in terms of this geopolitical struggle that's unfolding, that if U.S. imperialism can be pinned to the mat with regard to its struggle with the BRICS, particularly China, that inevitably will provide relief to Zimbabwe, to Iran, to Cuba, to Venezuela.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also wanted to ask you about Russia. While many have tried to frame Trump as less bellicose and war-hungry than Biden, it appears that President Trump has not only picked up from where Biden left off in trying to spark World War III, but that President Trump has upped the ante. First by going to war with Iran, not to mention dropping some of the biggest bombs known to mankind on Iran. And now President Trump has deployed 2 nuclear submarines off the coast of Russia. Meanwhile, Russia and China have launched joint military exercises in the Sea of Japan. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction to this dangerous game that President Trump is engaged in, seemingly trying to either bully Russia into submission or baiting them into an even broader war and potentially World War III?
Well, that news wrap up is very enlightening. Although I should mention quickly that the breaking news is that Mr. Trump has announced that he'll be meeting with Mr. Putin, presumably in a neutral site, and perhaps Mr. Zelensky of Ukraine as well. I'm not sure what this means in terms of these Biden-esque maneuvers that have just been referenced in terms of moving nuclear submarines closer to Russian territory. But I should also point out another item of news that was covered in the Financial Times of London, but not in many of the mainstream corporate media here in the United States of America. I'm speaking of this April 5th, 2025 article in the Financial Times of London, which says, after a lengthy investigation, that despite the claims that Russia had deserted Iran during its time of need, during the June 2025 piratical attack by Israel, the fact of the matter is that in the run-up to that piratical attack, there had been nuclear collaboration, says the Financial Times, between Russia and Iran, involving dual-use nuclear technology, dual use meaning both civilian and military. And if this story proves to be accurate from the August 5th, 2025 Financial Times, it sheds further light on why Mr. Trump might have taken this turn of negativity towards Russia. I should also mention that it also sheds further light on the point we discussed last week, which is the sellout by the European Union to U.S. imperialism with regard to the trade deal. And as we intimated last week, the so-called deal between the EU and the United States of America has to be looked at skeptically, number one, because there are not that many pages that memorialize this deal, which suggests that what we have is a conceptual framework more than a worked out trade deal. And in any case, with regard to these billions of dollars that the EU is supposed to invest in the US economy, the EU, of course, does not have the authority to compel private German industry to invest a penny into the United States of America. That is to say, they can only encourage, perhaps, German industry to do so. And so Mr. Trump, he likes apparently to be predictable, some might say erratic. And I think that with regard to his policy towards Russia, you see this exemplified, particularly if these news headlines pan out with regard to his having a summit with not only Mr. Putin, but Mr. Zelensky as well.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you about several news items related to Somaliland. On July 30th, it was reported that Somaliland, which declared independence from Somalia in 1991, is offering the United States a military base near the mouth of the Red Sea and access to critical minerals as part of its bid for international recognition. Although Washington continues to recognize Somalia's sovereignty over the territory, Somaliland's President Abdirahman Mohamed Abdullahi is actively courting U.S. support, positioning the semi-autonomous region in the broader contest for strategic influence and resources in Africa, as both China and the U.S. seek to deepen their footprint on the continent. Somaliland's President Abdullahi, who took office as President of Somaliland in 2024, said his administration is in talks with the U.S. Embassy in Somalia and the Department of Defense to forge new partnerships focused on security, counterterrorism, and economic cooperation. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction to this news, and how concerning is this?
Well, apparently the head of AFRICOM, the Africa Command of the Pentagon's mailed fists aimed at the heart of Africa, recently visited this breakaway land, speaking of Somaliland, with the idea apparently of establishing yet another U.S. military base in Africa to go along with this base in nearby Djibouti, not to mention the hundreds of other bases stretching from Japan through the Americas to Asia. And we should also put this news about Somaliland in the context of an abortive attempt, or an apparently abortive attempt by Ethiopia to establish a route to the sea via Somaliland. Recall that when Eritrea, a former province of Ethiopia, broke away from the Addis regime some decades ago, that removed Ethiopia's major port, its major outlet to the sea, and therefore Ethiopia has been relying heavily upon Djibouti, a separate and sovereign country, and therefore it thought it would be wise to establish another port in Somaliland. But that particular maneuver was objected to by the larger Somalia, headquartered in Mogadishu, and there hangs a tale, because according to recent press reports, the Mogadishu regime is being battered from pillar to post by Al-Shabaab, which the United States sees as a terrorist outfit. And that also is a worry to Turkey, which has been bolstering the Mogadishu regime in every route from picking up the garbage to airport security. And not to mention the fact that Egypt, in an attempt to put pressure on Ethiopia because of objection to Ethiopia's construction of the Renaissance Dam, which Egypt claims challenges its lifeblood, speaking of the Nile River, the overthrow, or certainly the progressive weakening of the Mogadishu regime, is not necessarily good news for either Ankara or Cairo. And I should also mention that if these stories about the weakening of the Mogadishu regime prove to be accurate, it also have knock-on effects and repercussions in neighboring Kenya, which has been rocked by street protests, which we had thought was going to lead to the downfall of President Ruto sooner rather than later. And so this news about Somaliland cuddling with U.S. imperialism comes in the context of these wider struggles. And certainly, I must say that is not good news.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you about a couple of books you have been reading. The first is entitled Zbig, The Life of Zbigniew Brzezinski, America's Great Power Prophet, written by Edward Luce, and was published this past May 2025. Zbig, as the title indicates, is a biography of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was President Carter's national security advisor. The other book we wanted to ask you about is entitled The Mission, The CIA in the 21st Century, written by Tim Weiner, and was just published last month, July 2025. Dr. Horne, what should our audience know about these two books?
Well, first of all, the Brzezinski book. Recall that he was a hawk. Recall that he was a Polish immigrant, not unlike Henry Kissinger, who spoke with a thick German accent, betraying his birth in Bavaria. Mr. Brzezinski had deep roots in the reactionary sector of the Polish ruling class, overthrown when communism came to power, or socialism came to power, more precisely, post-1945. And as Mr. Carter's national security advisor, he led a holy crusade against the Soviet Union. Of course, it has a lot to do with the star-crossed relations stretching back decades, if not centuries, between Poland and Russia. But what strikes me about this book, and I think that it's something that future journalists and historians are going to have to grapple with, is that Edward Luce, who, by the way, is the U.S. correspondent of the Financial Times of London. I should also mention that Mr. Brzezinski's daughter, the late Mr. Brzezinski, is the co-host of Morning Joe, the popular MSNBC cable program. And of course, Mr. Luce has been appearing quite frequently on that particular show in recent days. But the point I'd like to return to is that even though, like many in Washington and on Wall Street, he is ecstatic, speaking of Edward Luce, about Brzezinski's crusade against the Soviet Union that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union on December 25th, 1991. He gives short shrift to the price that was paid, not least the price with regard to the entente with the People's Republic of China. Now, to be sure, he does deal with that pivotal moment in world history in December 1978, January 1979, when the paramount Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping travels to the United States and receives a rapturous reception, particularly when he visits Texas and puts on a Texas cowboy hat. And this, of course, led to massive technology transfers from the United States to the People's Republic of China, creating a juggernaut. And as we've noted before, it's ironic and perversely paradoxical that when that capital flow began to flood across the Pacific, that the man at the controls was Leonard Woodcock. Yes, the former leader of the United Auto Workers, the first post-1949, post-Chinese Revolution ambassador, U.S. ambassador to China, which then makes all the more quizzical the fact that the UAW has not necessarily been on the proper side of history with regard to campaigning against Mr. Trump's tariff war. I should also mention, just as a personal note, that shortly after China helped to pay the debt that it took out with regard to these technology transfers by waging war on Vietnam. This is in the wake of Vietnam overthrowing the genocidal Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, 1979 approximately. I found myself in both Hanoi and Phnom Penh as part of a peace delegation. And therefore, I've been following very carefully since then this really despicable alliance between China and the United States in the immediate aftermath of that 1979 overthrow, where they, in a sense, were supporting the genocidal Khmer Rouge against the Vietnamese Communist Party. In any case, I think that Edward Luce has not said the last word. At least I hope he has not said the last word with regard to the import and the impact of this crusade led by these former Eastern European refugees or emigres, speaking of Kissinger and Brzezinski, who had so much impact upon U.S. foreign policy and upon anti-Sovietism in particular. Now, with regard to Tim Weiner's book, it reflects this civil war that has broken out within the intelligence community. I'm sure many in our audience are following the fact that a grand jury has been impaneled in South Florida to investigate the so-called Russiagate episode, that is to say 2016, when it has been alleged that Hillary Clinton, the Democratic Party, in league with James Comey, FBI director, Jim Clapper, the director of national intelligence, and John Brennan, the CIA director under Mr. Obama, basically colluded in an improper way. It is suggested to destabilize the incoming Trump administration incoming in 2017. Now, what's remarkable about this book is that it's basically a brief on behalf of Brennan and Clapper in particular. And like the books of Bob Woodward of the Washington Post, whereby you can tell what slant it's going to take by looking at who he interviews. If you give him an interview, you come out looking like a hero. If you don't, you look like a cad. And so on page 397, he points out and gives special thanks to John Brennan in particular, but also to William Burns, who was CIA director under Mr. Biden, not to mention Leon Panetta, who played a similar role under Mr. Obama. He also points out that 16 retired CIA officers quoted in this book had their clearances revoked by Trump on his first day in office. So there's a real civil war taking place in the intelligence community. It's unclear how it's going to eventuate, but do not be surprised if there are indictments forthcoming from that grand jury in South Florida, because as the saying goes, when a grand jury is impaneled, they're basically directed by the prosecutor, and the prosecutor can get the grand jury to indict a ham sandwich. And we should take seriously the idea that the ultimate target is one Barack Obama. Recall the meme that Mr. Trump released just a week or so ago, showing Mr. Obama being wrestled to the floor in the Oval Office and frog marched out, presumably to a prison cell. So stay tuned. But I'm afraid we've reached the end of the road.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.